In the early decades of the 19th century, the mid-Atlantic region of the United States was shaped by plantation agriculture, by complicated household economies, and by the legal and social systems that made human beings into property. Maryland, an Atlantic border state, occupied a particular position in this landscape, both a place of deep-rooted slavery and of regular contact with free ports and northern ideas. It is here in Talbot County and on the eastern shore that the life of Conterter Tryman Twain, Harriet Bailey, unfolded, a life lived mostly out of the historical spotlight, yet one whose quiet rhythms shaped a voice that later became central to American conscience. Harriet Bailey was born into the system of chattel slavery that bound mothers and children to the property interests of masters, and she lived within the routines of forced labor, family separations, and limited human autonomy that characterized so many enslaved women's lives. Her experience was not exceptional in terms of suffering, but it was singular in consequence. Through the child she bore. Frederick Douglass. Her presence and absence both entered the public record. This segment traces Harriet Bailey's life as a distinct human story. The constraints she faced, the choices that were possible to her, and the subtle ways in which a mother's love and the violence of separation became part of a larger history of freedom. Long making. To understand Harriet Bailey's life, it is necessary to situate it within the labor and household systems of early 19th century Maryland. Enslaved people in Talbot County worked both in field gangs and in household settings. Ownership patterns there often meant that individuals moved between plantations and households according to the needs or wills of slaveholders. Women like Harriet performed a variety of tasks: field labor, domestic work, child care, and seasonal obligations tied to the agricultural calendar. These duties were enforced by custom and by local legal frameworks that denied basic familial rights. Family separation was a routine instrument of control, and it shaped Harriet's story. Enslaved women often saw their children sold, moved, or assigned elsewhere. Under the principle of partus sequitur ventrem, children took the status of their mother, ensuring that the property value of enslaved women extended to their offspring. Harriet's son, born around Annecy, February 1818, was quickly removed from her custodial care. Frederick Douglass later described his mother as a presence seen only in the twilight hours, a figure who walked to the cabin where he slept and returned to distant fields before daylight. This pattern reflects a wider reality. Many enslaved mothers raised children at a distance or through intermittent visits because owners prioritized labor allocation over kinship continuity. Education and movement shaped the environments persons like Harriet inhabited. Nearby towns, such as Baltimore, provided urban contexts where some enslaved people gained limited exposure to literate culture, wage economies, or urban household work. But for Harriet, most of her adult life remained rooted in rural labor, under the authority of local planters. Medical care, nutrition, and maternal labor demands exerted heavy tolls. Mortality rates for enslaved women in childbirth were high, and the stresses of repeated pregnancies and physical labor were constant. Records about Harriet's later years are fragmentary. Contemporaneous documentation is sparse, and much must be read through the testimony of her son. In those testimonies, Harriet appears not as a historical absentee, but as a moral and emotional presence whose separations and sacrifices would mark a formative experience in Douglass's life. Harriet Bailey's life can be told most faithfully by tracing the ordinary days that, collected, reveal a life constrained and also quietly resistant. Born into bondage in Talbot County, Maryland, she entered a social order that treated her labor as property and her children as future assets. The circumstances of her early years are not fully recorded, a pattern common to many enslaved people. Yet the outlines of her experience are clear from later testimony. In Twit, 1818, a child was born who would later be called Frederick Douglass. From the beginning, the legal mechanics of slavery operated to separate mother and child. Young Frederick recalled that he was separated from his mother in infancy, and that he rarely saw her thereafter. Harriet continued her assigned labor under a system that moved people according to master's demands. She worked in fields and on plantations, some distance from the place where her son was raised. Despite the physical separation, there were nocturnal visits, small pilgrimages along plantation paths that allowed a mother to touch her child and to exchange a few whispered words before dawn. These brief encounters were the fragile threads sustaining kinship across enforced distance. Harriet's life included the recurring labors and hazards of enslaved womanhood. Work began early each morning and continued until the sun slid low. Hands made raw by repetitive tasks, the back bent by hoe or basket, nights taken by the language of prayer or by whispered counsel with other women about how to care for children left nearby. In these communal spaces, enslaved women cultivated strategies of care, the passing of knowledge, the concealment of small comforts, the sharing of food or clothing that kept daily life from becoming entirely unbearable. Such networks of mutual aid were subtle forms of resilience, and they shaped Harriet's capacity to sustain herself amid scarcity. Tragedy and loss threaded Harriet's later years. Frederick Douglass later wrote that his mother died when he was about 7 years old. The circumstances of her death are not exhaustively documented in surviving records. Contemporary sources are few, and Douglass's own reminiscences emphasize the moral meaning of the event more than the precise cause. Whether from illness, the physical toll of repeated pregnancies, or the general hardships of enslaved life, her passing removed one of the earliest anchors of his existence. For the child left behind, absence itself became a formative narrative element, a recurring sorrow that shaped Douglass's later insistence on family dignity and the human costs of bondage. Harriet's absence from her son's daily life did not render her influence null. In small gestures, a visit under moonlight, a touch upon a sleeping child's brow, the whisper of a prayer, she conveyed presence, protection, and an implicit moral lesson. Those night walks, which Douglass remembered with plaintive clarity, were acts of maternal fidelity under conditions that forbade normal family life. They testified both to the cruelty of a system that held mothers apart from children and to the moral agency of those who resisted that cruelty through minimal but meaningful acts. Through these episodes, we also glimpse the social world around Harriet. The planter households, the overseers, the markets where enslaved people might be sold or traded, and the networks of kin that extended across plantations. Community obligations, religious observance, and ritualized speech gave structure to life. In those contexts, Harriet's daily choices, whether to share a crust of bread, to conceal a small medicine, or to time a visit to a child, were significant moral acts. They were modest, often invisible to outside recorders, but they sustained families and kept memory alive. When Harriet died, the immediate practical consequences for her child were severe. Further dislocation, the deepening of orphaned status, and a strengthened encounter with the institutional dimensions of slavery. Yet, in a quieter sense, her life also transmitted a legacy of endurance. The lessons embedded in nighttime visits, in the courage of a mother who risked punishment to touch her child for a few stolen moments, remained in the memory and shaped the moral development of Frederick Douglass. In later years, as he invoked his mother in speeches and writings, he did not only memorialize personal loss, he used that memory as a rhetorical instrument to show the nation what slavery demanded and what human attachment could not be fully extinguished. Harriet Bailey's life invites several interpretive insights. First, it highlights how the institution of slavery used legal principles and property practices to interrupt the most basic human bonds, most notably the bond between mother and child. The enforcement of labor allocation and the commodification of reproductive labor meant that kinship was regularly subordinated to economic calculus. Harriet's intermittent presence in her son's life exemplifies this structural violence. Second, her story shows the moral economy of small acts. Historians have emphasized that large political narratives often obscure quotidian forms of resistance. Harriet's nightly visits, her sharing of food or small remedies, her endurance through pregnancy and labor. These were not grand rebellions, but they were persistent assertions of dignity within a coercive regime. They are a reminder that resistance takes multiple forms, and that moral courage often appears in tiny, repetitive gestures. Third, the fragmentary nature of the archival record regarding Harriet Bailey underscores a methodological point. Many enslaved women's lives are accessible primarily through secondary testimony or the memories of relatives. This forces modern readers to balance respect for incomplete evidence with careful inference. In this case, Frederick Douglass's recollections illuminate Harriet while also shaping how history receives her. His testimony is invaluable, yet it must be read alongside the broader social patterns of Maryland slavery to form a fuller picture. The immediate consequence of Harriet Bailey's life, and of her death while her son was still a child, was to shape Frederick Douglass's moral imagination. The experience of maternal separation became a recurring motif in his narrative of bondage. It formed part of the evidence he would later deploy to argue for abolition. Harriet's life thus operated as both personal memory and political testimony. By invoking his mother's intermittent tenderness and the violence of enforced separation, Douglass furnished a human face to abolitionist rhetoric. More broadly, Harriet's story exemplifies the demographic and social consequences of slavery in the Upper South. The forced mobility of enslaved people, the instability of family life, and the gendered burdens placed on women produced enduring patterns of social fragmentation. These patterns influenced community formation, survival strategies, and post-emancipation family reconstruction. The memory of mothers like Harriet also fed into later cultural expressions, song, oral history, and literary testimony that would keep alive the emotional truths of slavery for subsequent generations. Finally, Harriet's life contributed indirectly to political outcomes. Through her son's writings and speeches, the lived reality of mother's suffering reached a national audience. The moral pressure such testimony generated helped mobilize opinion and political energy for abolition, and later for the protections sought during Reconstruction. In this way, a personal life, lived largely outside formal records, became part of a chain of influence that affected national change. As we leave the life of Harriet Bailey, we carry two quiet observations forward. First, that the history of great struggles is composed of innumerable ordinary lives. Each small act of care, each hidden sacrifice, weaving into larger movements for justice. And second, that memory can be a form of power. The memory of a mother's footsteps beneath moonlight, transformed into testimony that helped reframe a nation's conscience. In the next segment, we will widen our focus from individual memory to collective institutions, examining how family separation, labor regimes, and legal frameworks operated across the Upper South, and how communities cultivated practices of survival and solidarity within those constraints. We will listen gently to the stories of kinship, ritual, and resistance, and consider how they shaped the long arc toward emancipation.